Okay, good morning. So we're going to start with chapter 20, the processes of evolution. So, evolution is a change, a genetic change in a population over time. Okay, so it's important to distinguish this as a population level phenomenon. Individuals cannot evolve. This happens in a population over time. We could also phrase this as saying it's a change in allele frequency. In a population, over multiple generations. So, if we're going to talk about evolution, we really do need to bring up Charles Darwin, who is the father of evolutionary theory. So he is a British naturalist who was doing his work in the early-ish 1800s. And he is probably, one of the things he's well known for is a 5-year voyage to survey, the South American coastline. He went on board as a naturalist. He was not the captain or anything. He was the naturalist. And he made many observations on this trip, all around, pretty much everywhere they stopped, but particularly in South America and on this chain of islands here called the Galapagos Islands. He was very inspired by his observations of plants, animals, and the geography and geology of the area. And, came to some important conclusions about life. The dominant mindset of the time. So the dominant mindset of the time was that the Earth was relatively young, maybe like 6,000 years old, and that species were unchanging. And Charles Darwin, made this realization that, in fact, that, based on everything he was seeing, that was wrong. That in fact the Earth was quite old and species did change. They did change over time. Now he did have some contemporaries that also were kind of coming to some of these same conclusions, but the very important thing that Charles Darwin did is that he was the first to propose the correct mechanism of how species change over time. And we're going to get into that story. But let's start with just kind of talking about what Charles Darwin actually saw when he made this trip. And we're going to focus here on the Galapagos Islands. So one of the things let me back up a little bit. So these Galapagos Islands are relatively young islands that straddle the equator, and they are not uniform. Okay, these islands differ from each other in terms of their climate, in terms of their geography, in terms of the vegetation present. So they, I know we look at them and it's like, oh, they're all kind of close together, but they're different. They're different. So what Charles Darwin saw is that there were, different species inhabiting the different islands, of course, and that there were very unusual animals that were different from but that resembled a species on the mainland. And these organisms on the island are what we would call endemic, which means they're found only in one location. Okay, so for example, we have the Galapagos penguin, right? We have the Galapagos tortoise. We have the Galapagos marine iguana. These are not found anywhere else in the world. And they have their own unique, they are their own unique species that we don't find anywhere else, but they do resemble the mainland organisms quite a bit. Darwin also noted many examples of adaptations. Adaptations are inherited characteristics that increase the survival and reproduction of an organism in their given environment. Right, so probably the poster child example are the Galapagos finches. So this is a group of finches that Darwin studied, and there were several different species. I believe the correct count is 13 different species inhabiting the different islands. And each of these birds had slightly different adaptations that made them best suited to the particular habitat of the island that they lived on. And this can most clearly be seen when looking at the size of the beaks. Let me see if I can get my pointer to work here. No such luck. All right, well, sorry about that. So when we see the size of the beaks, whether you had sort of a heavy, large beak versus a small, more picked beak, or even an elongated beak, these beak sizes and beak depths matched up with the predominant type of food available on their particular island. So, for example, if we're looking at something like this large ground finch, with this hard, heavy beak, the environment that this animal lived in was one where the available food source was hard, thick-shelled seeds that needed a strong, heavy beak in order to crack them open. Whereas if you had more of a elongated beak, such as the cactus ground finch, this particular bird, for example, might have been drinking nectar out of cactus flowers. Or if we have some kind of, sharp-beaked bird, perhaps this bird is eating insects. And he found this over and over and over again, that they matched their environment in order to be most successful. But that they all resembled the ancestor finch on the mainland. And that is kind of, spoiler alert, that is what Darwin's kind of big hypothesis was. So that we had this mainland finch. So the mainland, I'm talking about South America. Mainland South American finch that went and colonized the different islands. And then those populations diversified. Let me see if I can spell it right. On the different islands. Giving rise to new species on each island. Okay, so this is big. Darwin connected this idea of adaptation to your environment to the formation of new species. So Darwin hypothesized that the process of accumulating adaptations, numerous adaptations in a new environment, could lead to speciation. Oops. And he referred to this process of accumulating adaptations as natural selection. So let me just write a definition of that a little more clearly, because that is a very important term, is natural selection. So natural selection the process in which individuals that have certain inherited traits such as a big heavy beak to crack open big heavy seeds, tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals because of those traits. Okay, and that's an important point, because of those traits. So this is the mechanism of evolution. So Darwin came up with this idea of evolution by natural selection. This idea that we have individuals with certain inherited, genetically passed on traits that allow them to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals. So for example, kind of a simple example, but a very, actually, pretty realistic example. So say you have a population of beetles, and this population of beetles perhaps moves to an environment where the background is darkly colored, and maybe inhabiting some dark rocks or something, I don't know. And if you have a lighter colored phenotype, okay, that pen is not working, sorry. If you have a lighter colored shell, you are more visible to predators. If you have a darker colored shell, you are less visible to predators. So those individuals that had the inherited trait of the darker colored shell are less likely to get eaten by predators, right? The predator is going to see the lighter colored beetle and eat all the lighter colored beetles. The darker colored beetles, because of those alleles for the darker color, because of those inherited traits to have darker color, survive at a higher rate than the others. And so they reproduce more offspring, and thus their genes for those darker colored shells are passed on to the next generation, and that is natural selection at work. And over time, the population shifts so that most individuals have that dark colored shell, because that is more adaptive. So we see something that is similar that we've been doing for eons as humans, and that is called artificial selection. So artificial selection is the human modification of other species by selecting and breeding individuals with desired traits. Okay, so modification of a species by breeding individuals with desired traits. So So a good example is many of the things we don't particularly like to eat, such as cabbage and broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, all are really from the same species of wild mustard. And it just kind of depends what we've selected for. So humans have, for example, taken the leaves of wild mustard and bred a plant that had big leaves with another plant with big leaves, and just kept doing that and selecting for bigger and bigger leaves, and we end up with something like kale. Or selecting for a bigger and bigger terminal bud, that's just the little bud at the tip, giving us eventually cabbage. So it's the same concept, except for humans are doing it instead of nature doing it. I don't care how many people say that if you roast kale it tastes like potato. It doesn't. It's good for you though. Okay, so that is artificial selection, and it kind of shows how natural selection works. It's the same base set for we're letting nature do the sorting when it comes to natural. Okay, so to clarify, before I get on to the next slide, let's do a little summary to make this clear. These are important. So evolution. Change in allele frequency. In a population over time. Natural selection process, or you could say the mechanism, okay? So the process by which individuals with certain traits, aka adaptations, survive, reproduce at higher rates. They then contribute their alleles to the next generation, whereas those that did not survive and reproduce are not going to contribute their alleles to the next generation. So, we talked also about something called relative fitness. Okay, so this doesn't mean how many burpees you can do. It is relative fitness in an evolutionary context is the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation. So it doesn't matter how strong or fast you are if you do not contribute your genes to the next generation, your fitness is zero. So these are three very important terms that you should be familiar with.